Okay, so chapter 5, book presentation number 2. The book starts to build out and progress into like stress and how to define it and understanding the stress process. Now, I will tell you, when you coach people, you have to understand that you have many different types of stress. It can be family, it could be, well, social in general, but family, significant other, could be school, could be work, could be the fear of losing scholarship, performing at practice to be able to actually play. These are all types of stressors, and our body has to process these. Now, as a coach, or a physical therapist or trainer, we're actively applying a stressor on the human organism to try to get a training response. Very much as a general adaptation syndrome in terms of, you zap a single cell organism to get a response or an adaptation from that organism. Here you are as a coach, and you're trying to scientifically understand the art of applying stress to the human organism, meaning your athlete. And with that, you're looking at this in terms of how much is too much, how much is just right. And because we have so many different types of stress, and because our bodies process stress, and each person processes stress differently, you sometimes have to delve into the art of coaching to be able to understand when you might have an athlete who is overstressed and they just can't handle anymore. They're just out of bandwidth, if I can use that terminology again. So you got to understand it in terms of understanding this through your particular lens as a physical therapist, as a coach, as a personal trainer. You're sometimes asking an athlete to perform a task and maybe they can't do it. And that sometimes is a failure of the coach because they've not shown the athlete through maybe a whole part whole methodology how to do the different subcomponents to be able to be successful in the activity itself. You want your athletes always falling forward. They might make mistakes, they might fail, but you want them to fall forward and learn from their mistakes in a positive light. With a personal training client or a physical therapy client, you're taking somebody who maybe had a TKA, a total knee arthroplasty, and they have a new knee, they have a component down there, and they're just not comfortable yet in being able to move like you want them to move. You may have to take them, excuse the pun, through baby steps first to be able to do that. We have these stressors, and then you're placing them on as a coach or a physical therapist or as a personal trainer. You have to be skilled to be able to set your people up to succeed. I digress. They define 4 different interrelated stages of stress. You have the environmental demand, the perception of demand, the stress response, and the behavioral consequence. And now with this, when we look at these 4 areas, the environmental, like I mentioned before, it could be your opponent, it could be your coach, it could be the environment you're playing in, it could be the floor you're playing on, whatever it may be, or the grass you're playing on versus turf. The perception of demand, that's how the athlete or the participant is interpreting all those data points. You have their response to that stress. And then after that, the behavioral consequence, right? So how they respond physically. So with this, the environmental demand, what it may be, it could be a coach, it could be your opponent is forcing you to do a particular move on the wrestling mat to be able to defend yourself. It could be executing a particular skill, as they note in volleyball. They don't really note this, but the onus of demand regarding environmental demand, it can come from any number of different sources. And you have to be able, as a coach, to understand that you're part of that environmental demand. You're delivering those requests or demands, if you will, for athletes to do particular things in the practice environment or the game environment. And you have to make sure that you've adequately prepared them to be able to fulfill. Otherwise, you're creating a high stress environment and perhaps a high failure environment for your athletes. Now, when you work with younger athletes, oftentimes you'll hear, well, there's no way I could do that. That's impossible, et cetera. And that becomes kind of like a self-preservation process, where they don't want to take ownership of the fact that they can't do something. They're, in essence, what they're saying is, I don't even want to try because I'm fearful or scared that I will not be able to do, or I will just completely fail the task that's being delivered to me. So again, if you hear that coming from your athletes, that is a very clear message to you as a coach that you're not adequately preparing your athletes for success because you've not given them the skills to be successful. And I don't care if you're working in an accounting department or you're a defensive backs coach for football. If you start hearing those types of feedback responses and feedback loops out of people, yes, it could be partially how they're wired and partially based upon their own behavioral norms, but in some regard, it's you as a coach. You have to be able to prepare your athletes to be able to understand, find ways to be successful. So let's go into perception. They'll process the environment, they'll process that environmental demand, and you have to understand that not all your athletes are going to process the environmental demand the same. It could be the same stimuli, but much like, again, our people who perform the skill in front of an audience, some were well trained, others were not to complete a complex task. Within that framework, you have some athletes and participants who will process that stress and rise to the occasion and find it to be a challenge. Others will find it to be too much of a challenge and they wither away. So a person who has a high competency in a particular functional area, they'll perceive it as a low threat. Sure, coach, you want me to go out and do this? Done. I got you covered. I had an athlete that I worked with at the University of Arizona, and I took him through ladder drills, and I might have mentioned in another video, and I said, hey, I need you to do this, this, and this with your footwork because it'll translate to the release technique when you release from the ladder. He's like, yeah, coach, got it. He did it. I'm like, whoa. So he had a very high competency, and what the directive I gave him, which is basically an environmental demand, was processed by him, was interpreted and processed by him in a way that was so smooth and non-threatening because he was very confident he could do the skill. He had a very high competency. Now, a person with low competency will perceive the threat as the same threat, if you will, and process it as a high stressor. And now you think back again to that example of the folks in front of the audience, the ones who were well prepared did well in front of the audience. The ones who were not well prepared did not do well in front of the audience. The ones who did well had the low stress, if you will, environment, the low stress, the lower perception of demand. And then the folks who were not well prepared had a higher perception of demand and higher anxiety regarding the demand itself. So when we look at the different types of anxiety, we hit on some of them earlier, their trait anxiety greatly influences how the person perceives the world, right? If they have a high anxiety driver, everything is like a threat to them. And high trait anxiety people perceive situations, especially competitive ones, as more threatening than others. And it comes down to how the person's wired, and much like my person at the University of Arizona, what their skill level is and what their competency is. And as a coach, you kind of have to have a grasp in terms of what your athletes can and can't do, but also what they can and cannot process effectively. Now, their response. Their main response is broken out into two main areas, whether it's physical or psychological. And if you have the ability to perform a task, we're talking about the ability to perform a task and perform it effectively or not effectively. You can increase state anxiety, the cognitive side, and can also heighten the physiological activation or the somatic state anxiety. So as a coach, you start to evaluate your athletes. As a physical therapist, you start to evaluate your patients and start to realize you're giving a directive, you're providing them with a directive to complete a task, and to that person, because of their TKA, their knee replacement, they perhaps might not even process that they can step up onto a riser. They can. You've done it 1,000 times. You have an entire body of work with all the people you've worked with before. But to that person, in that moment, it feels like an impossibility because there is no feedback loop for them in their knee. They have titanium. They don't have bones anymore. They have no way to have any kind of proprioception or K awareness, kinesthetic awareness, where that knee is in space. But that's part of your job, is to walk them through and guide them through that process to be able to regain their confidence that they can do those skills. But to that person in that moment, they have a high state anxiety and they have a high physiological heightened physiological activation because there's somatic state anxiety. They physically don't think they can do it, and their body's not responding to responding to that directive. So now, what the book notes is with the stress response that you'll have these deleterious effects in terms of concentration, meaning you'll have less concentration, and you'll also end up having increased muscle tension. And they reference this later on when you talk about in a study, people had heightened muscle tension both before, during, and after a particular event. Now, the behavioral consequences. The behavior of the person will vary, and the person that's in front of you will matter. Some people will, rise to the occasion. Some people flourish. Some people fold. Some people have the ability to process stress and be able to manifest that into a positive behavior cycle or a positive behavior loop. If the athlete can't process that stress, and I think this is important to kind of take a sidebar as a coach, you have to understand it. You have to be able to articulate to your athletes, hey, you're being put under or in a high stress environment. As a way to process that, realize you need to kind of feel the fear and do it anyways. You need to feel that anxiety and still perform. You need to understand that, yes, this is part of what we do in a sport environment, but you still need to perform anyways. It's not being condescending or rude or dismissive to that person. It's giving them the latitude to basically own that stress, feel that stress, and understand that that's a natural part of the process. And then they can manifest out the idea that they can go on a court and still, even in a high stress environment, perform. So what happens in the behavioral side, though, is when an athlete doesn't buy into that and they start to perform poorly, their stress level increases. They do worse. Their stress level goes up. They do worse. So it becomes like this widening crevasse between their stress level going up and their performance level going down, and there's just no reclaiming that until you actually pull that athlete out and have a conversation with them to get them to kind of reposition themselves. So you, as a coach, have to recognize that as soon as possible and take that athlete out of that situation before they go from bad to worse to terrible. And then pull them aside and create that positive feedback loop to help them regain their confidence to be able to be successful yet once again. Not easy, right? It's not easy, but as a coach, as a physical therapist, personal trainer, whatever your movement practitioner discipline will be, you have to recognize that process quickly and intervene quickly in a way where it's, hey, Jimmy, I see what's going on. Let's take you out. We'll give you a minute. We'll kind of get you recentered. Never is it, Jimmy, you're doing terrible. Get the heck out of the game. Go sit on the bench. No, you have to help that athlete process what's going on. And once they understand and have an understanding of the process that's basically causing them this negative cycle, they can then stop and then reverse the cycle. That's your job as a coach. Next video.